The Portuguese by Brock is an example of a very early cubic work, probably the more traditional sense of cubism that stems from works by Paul Cezanne, who we've gone over in class, and also the work of Pablo Picasso. This kind of era of art is pretty polarizing. I'm just going to look at the image for just a moment, see what you can recognize, if anything. If not being able to recognize anything, does that kind of impact your impression of the piece? Does it have to be beautiful? Does it have to be easily understood? Those are kind of the questions that come up with Cubism, especially Cubism in this particular moment in history in 1911. So first of all, Cubism subjects are pretty traditional, which is interesting because they're depicting them in ways that are completely non-academic, non-traditional, and accepted ways. So they're painting portraits, like the Portuguese is a portrait. They often started off with landscapes, but that kind of dwindled away after a while. Still lifes are very popular subjects for cubic artists, and figures, objects, mostly figures of people, objects like musical instruments and so on. And so the Portuguese is one of the earliest Cubism works and known as what's called Analytical Cubism, where I'll be talking about that more in depth when we get to content. But when Braque saw Picasso's piece Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is really kind of a proto-cubic piece, an early kind of introduction to this concept of breaking objects down and breaking figures of people down into fragmented shapes. That's kind of where the Baroque style then develops and comes from. Baroque did not like Les Demoiselles, but couldn't stop thinking about it. So it was very much an impact on him. And he's also deeply impacted by Paul Cezanne. And Paul Cezanne, who we are studying in class together, is the champion of analyzing a scene, typically a landscape where he was working in the south of France, and breaking the scene down, breaking the objects and figures down into geometric shapes, patches of color, showing multiple viewpoints of something at one time. That's deeply influential to Braque as well. So if you're looking to attribute his work to other artists, definitely Picasso, absolutely Paul Cezanne. And the paintings I have here on this slide, the one on the bottom that I'm pointing to with the arrow is Cezanne's work of a Roman aqueduct and just a landscape, showing that kind of initial early beginning to abstract the landscape and break it down into fragmented pieces. And then on the upper right is Braque's version of that subject, because he went to the south of France and he was just intrigued and had to kind of study this type of art, this way to view a scene and the way to treat painting. And so that's one of his versions of the aqueduct, that Roman aqueduct. So another thing about Cubism, occurring in the early 20th century, like around 1911 or so, you're reflecting a modern industrialized world. So it's not surprising that the paintings and the objects within them start to look very geometric, start to look like machine parts. So it is almost like you are merging those two worlds together, the world of industry and machines, the fast-paced life, with then now looking at these different scenes like these landscapes here and breaking these natural items down into very much like machine-based geometric cubic shapes. So that's one. And then the other thing is that when you have an industrialized world, busy, and I've talked about that before, and not only that, but you have a world that is starting to get more tense, and in just 3 short years will eventually erupt into World War I. You've got a world that is, in a way, kind of fracturing apart itself. So it's kind of not surprising that an art style develops that reflects that sense of fracturing, of breaking into pieces, shattering into separate pieces, fracturing apart from one another. So it's an interesting time to have this kind of art era come to the forefront. So content-wise, again, we're going to call this analytical cubism, where you're taking an object. In this case, it is a man with a guitar. I know, but trust me. And it's based on Brock seeing a musician, most likely in Portugal, and analyzing a human being, a musical instrument here, and the guitar, and breaking that down into pieces and showcasing that object from multiple views at once. So when you look at this painting, you're seeing the musician from the front, the back, the side, inside, outside, top, bottom, all at the same time. Same thing with the guitar. And it's interesting because the critics and people who talk about Cubism talk about representing objects and things in their truest form. That when you see something from just the front, you're not seeing it in its truest way. You're seeing, if you're painting a house and you're just painting the front of it, you're not painting its full truth. The full truth, it has a roof, it has a back, it has sides, it has a bottom foundation, it has an interior, it has all of those things. So the cubic artists are trying to show that all the parts of it in its most complete form at one time. Now, it's not going to make it look realistic. That's not the point. The point is to really show it in its truest form. And then that's why also you have a monochromatic color palette typically in these analytical cubic pieces, where, like the Impressionists were interested in how light impacts color. And so, light is going to then distort the truth of the object. That's how the cubic artist would look at it. So let's get rid of light, make it even light across. Let's choose one kind of color palette, a monochromatic color here of browns. And then that's going to depict the truest image of the objects as well. So strip it of color. It's going to give a true sense of the object without influence of light. It's going to flatten out the image as well, because why would we paint the illusion of space? That's a falsehood as well. This is a canvas that is flat, so let's embrace that quality about it. And that's why you have the stenciled letters. If you look up at the top right and a little bit in the left upper portion, there are also some numbers stenciled in kind of the below the main letters up to the top right. There's some numbers just down below. So, and that's really the only realistic image in items in the image. You can see there's an O, a B, an A, an L, a C, some numbers there too. Those are the realistic things. And the only realistic things in this image, only things that you can see that are definitely recognizable, are the things that are very two-dimensional. And so you have that shown in a lot of cubic art pieces because, one, they're trying to emphasize the flatness of the canvas and the flatness of painting as a technique, not trying to create the illusion like you did in Renaissance art that it was three-dimensional. And it also too reflects the time period where newspapers, getting out information was kind of the pervasive way that you communicated information was through newspapers. And so let's have a reference to that in your image where you're giving information, the truth about an object. So it's an interesting way to approach an image. Again, think of it like, and I think in Khan Academy they talk about this, if you're trying to depict a cup, like a paper cup, that to really do that, if I just held it up in front of you, you would just see one part of it. Even if I turned it around or upside down, you'd still see only that one or two parts at one time. So the cubic artist would take that cup and tear it into pieces and put it on a table in front of you. It's like, there, you're seeing part of the front, the sides, the insides, the outsides, all at one time. And isn't that more of the truth of the item? it's deep thinking, and that's why I actually really enjoy the cubic works. It's a fascinating kind of look at objects when we've been so used to seeing them naturalistically, so used to seeing things kind of spoon fed to us as truth and reality that's easily recognizable. But here it's got to work a little harder. But in the cubic mind, once you do, you'll see the complete truth of the items. So here are just a couple other images from Baroque, so you can enjoy. One in the middle is a still life of cards on table. So that's a table with like playing cards and like a bowl of fruit. And it just looks like you've taken a steamroller over all of it. And then the two images on the ends are of musical instruments there. So that again is Cubism. So I would suggest that for function here, it's definitely an aesthetic. Them going for a truthful aesthetic that is reflective of the complete truth of the objects and the complete truth of the technique of painting. And then for formal qualities, we could use color again. So color isn't the influence on the object, and it helps flatten out the image. Then also, of course, shape, where you're fracturing apart an object or objects into their basic geometric shapes. So again, that is the Portuguese by George Braque, a contemporary to Picasso, a man who painted quite a bit alongside Picasso. In fact, sometimes it's very hard to see the difference between their two works. So he is probably the premier cubic artist along with Picasso, and one who definitely was challenging the traditional academic world of painting.